Okay, well, next up is Chris Thomas.
Good afternoon,
in the
James.
hot seat. How are you?
Fine, thank you, James. Thanks for coming into Tynwald. Sorry you're only in the committee room. It's a shame we couldn't be somewhere else in the building.
The focus is on us. We are the people of importance.
Okay.
So I think, well, I'll start with the same question I just sort of asked Kate. And we can come on to your sort of your own sort of points later if you want. There's been a lot of discussion, obviously, in the last week or two about what's happened with the local authorities, specifically about the areas where there aren't enough candidates to stand. And as you know, we had a conversation with Phil and Jed Power about sort of how that could be resolved. And then I had a conversation with a young lady down in Ballabeg. And that conversation only came off because she made quite an interesting comment just off the cuff that she would like to have stood for local authority in Arbury, but she's got 3 young kids and a husband working long hours, and she just didn't feel like she wasn't confident enough to make that commitment. Mm-hmm. I thought, well, that to me that was quite an interesting sort of breakdown of the situation. You've got places where there aren't enough people standing, and then you've got people like her, and I don't think she's unique at all. I think she's quite a common situation, difficult, sort of not difficult, but doesn't balance with having that commitment, having having the family commitments coming first. And so we'd spoken about sort of options for digital inclusion, and how much. And I've basically asked Kate about that, and I thought, well, just see what you thought really, because it seems, in terms of somebody who doesn't really understand all the sort of legal ramifications, it seems so easy for me that somebody like her, who is politically minded and is committed to her community, could be involved so simply with the technology that we have now. If I'm not sort of suggesting that we completely wipe the slate clean with the system that we have, but it's clearly the system that we have is struggling because there aren't people involved. And I thought, well, there must be some way to sort of simply sort of integrate those two groups of people. And I know that you're involved in the municipal association, so I'll see what you think really.
Well, I'm also a local government unit political member, so it's quite a live issue, and there are several issues that you raised underneath the main one. The first one is sort of evening versus daytime and time availability, and that can be about when you schedule the meeting, and then there are all sorts of cost implications of doing that, because for instance it makes sense perhaps to do it in the evening for some people, but that has implications for staff time, officer time, because you need professional advice when you're there. Another level to what you said was about doing things digitally, but there's a third level, which is what's the role of a politician, either at local level or at national level. And I think a lot of people, perhaps encouraged by Mr. Bell's statement, for instance, or even Mrs. Cannell's statement, that we would encourage people into local politics by giving them more power. I don't actually think that's what people want, and I don't actually think that's what we want politicians for. My understanding is that people who are community minded and people who are politically minded, they want to have an influence in the decisions that are made. And what I mean by an influence is making sure the policies suit and that their local knowledge and the local conditions are taken into account. I think through statements like having local political decisions about planning, statements about having commissioners involved in who gets public sector housing, commissioners' houses, is perhaps looking at it the wrong way. I would actually quite like the process of making a planning decision to be the right policy applied fairly and objectively. I would like to think that houses, which is the largest area of local authority activity, I would like to think that the right people are living in them for the right period of time in the right way. And it's not necessarily that we actually need politicians involved in making those decisions. So I put it back to you that you're all about, I think, policy back to the people. I'm not so sure about that. I don't actually think the people want to be fully involved in making the decisions. They want to be involved in making sure that the policy is the proper public policy, and they want to make sure that where they want to influence the decision making, they can influence the decision making, and that's not necessarily the same thing as deciding the political question. So to answer your question, it's great that people have a community involvement. I don't think it suits many people to be as fully involved in politics as some of us are, and so therefore any development has to recognise that.
Well, I see your point, but I mean, what does a local authority actually do at the moment? It makes decisions on all those areas, planning and local housing and the whole list. So what you're in effect saying is that there should be less decisions and more clear sort of more clearly defining policy so that there doesn't have to be as many decisions?
At the moment, the most important thing that local authorities do is that most of them is act as housing authorities. That's where more than half the money is spent.
Yeah.
So that's about how you maintain houses, how you invest in new houses, how you go about allocating the people who live in those houses, how you go about taking rents from them, how you persuade national politicians to contribute to that process so that public purpose is served by actually giving an income tax subsidy to make sure that the housing is affordable in public sector. Other important areas of local authorities are to do with waste collection, and then we go down street lighting, environmental health. And what I'm saying is that lots of those topics are actually about officers making objective decisions, and that's something we've got to address. We've got to make sure that we have the right number of people involved in politics, directly involved, making public policy and overseeing the political process. But more importantly, we want to make sure that national politicians and politicians who are making decisions locally are actually influenced by what the people need and want and tell them they need and want.
But to come to what you made the point in there, that in that list that you've sort of expanded, there are quite a lot of decisions in there, and what I think you said is that those decisions need to be objectively made by effectively the staff of the local authority. So do you think then that the general public of the local authority area don't want to be involved in those?
I would think I would feel safest if I was a commissioner with having complete control over the public policy, the policy nature of the decisions, having enough information to be able to make sure that the process is working fairly and efficiently. But I don't think I would necessarily want to be the one who actually makes the decision. I just want to be able to influence the decision to make sure the policy, the information, the system, those sorts of things are working. Because otherwise I'm getting involved in areas that I don't know so much about. I'm a politician, I'm not a manager of housing, I'm not a manager of planning. And so therefore I'm not covered. I haven't got the background, I haven't got the indemnity insurance, and also I'm under a lot of influence to make decisions in certain ways. So that goes to the crux of the real issue. Politicians are not actually managers. Politicians are politicians. They make policies.
Yeah, I take your point.
They get involved in politics. We have to leave the management. And so the whole issue now about local authorities and housing authorities is about how we balance efficiency and organisation and delivery of service versus the right public policy context. And that public policy context is making sure that there's proper oversight of the processes, and also that policy is developing properly or even being implemented properly if we've got the right policies at the minute. Yeah,
so if we look at a particular scenario, if you've got somebody working for a local authority who's making a decision on a housing matter, I suppose the two parts. The first part is who is responsible for that decision. I mean, is it that individual? Is it that sort of member of staff? Obviously, if he's given responsibility to make those decisions, it must be him.
Or her. But it's not actually. It's the system in which the decision is made. So for housing, we're trying to move, and we have moved more successfully, almost completely now, to a pointing system, so people can know where they are on the pointing system, they know how they get points, and then we need politicians surrounding the process, but there's no reason why officers can't do them themselves, to set up the proper little group of people and the evidence, such that if there is a freedom of information challenge or an individual subject access request under data protection law, the person who's made that request, or the person who has those doubts about the fairness of the decision, will be persuaded that the decision has been made properly, and they've got to, something, and the other person has more need of the house than they have, and they're in the queue, and so on and so on. So we need objectivity, in my view.
Okay, well, I can hear the beeper going, so I'll reset the camera.
So in summary, politics is about the way I think you approach politics, thinking of yourself as a direct Democrat, okay?
Well, no, I take your point in so much as that, like, to go back to that example, if you've got somebody who's making a decision on a housing matter, whether it's a material, physical housing matter or who is in the housing, I suppose the problem is that let's say you've got somebody in a local authority who's having to make a decision about what actual material is going to be used or how something is actually going to be done. Now, I can see that there's a professional process that is logical there, like somebody knows the best way to put a roof on or whatever, or somebody knows, and that the policy could help sort of direct that, so more efficient, less efficient, more cost, and so that's whereas when you get down to a situation of who might actually be getting to live in that house, it becomes a lot more emotive, and I suppose that the perception of objectivity becomes a lot more difficult to maintain.
Exactly.
It's quite difficult to set a policy and remain
that's
objective.
where local people come in through their commissioners and directly. We need to make sure that all of the factors that need to be taken into account in any decision are taken into account, and local commissioners are very good at making sure that the information that's necessary for that decision to be made is there in place.
To go back a step, obviously, to take your sort of basic concept there, and in front of say in principle, I don't really. I think there's something sort of that I can agree with there. To go, to set these policies, you still do need some input from the community.
Exactly.
So in principle, you're quite happy with the idea, the concept that could be done. Not necessarily completely digitally, but there could be quite a lot of digital input into that, as you say, because in your sort of model in your head, you're actually stepping the commissioners back a certain, you're splitting a little bit the decision-making process. Now, if we go with that model in my head, it actually makes it easier for somebody like this young lady, Ali, that I spoke to be able to have an opinion on a policy direction for that. And so, in principle, you don't have a problem with that.
No, and the main question I'd ask anybody who wants to be involved in public policy is why they want to be involved in public policy. I would say the genuine reason that politicians I want representing me should have an interest in being involved in politics and public policy because they care about public policy. They want to influence the way that decisions are made about this or that. I think as you get more involved in public policy, you realise that that's associated with power and influence and abilities to make decisions. But I don't think it's healthy to actually go into politics because you want power or you want to make decisions. Or
Isn't that why everybody goes in?
I don't think so. I think the public are actually very sensible, and I think they can see through that. I hope so. And what I think the genuine reason is that you care. I mean, you obviously care about something passionately at the minute, and so therefore you've gone into public policy not as a candidate, but to make this happen as providing a platform for conversation. And that's the right motive. The right motive is because you care about housing, or you care about planning, or you care about the way that the national income is being constructed and divided, or you have a better idea about how these things can be done. You care about public sector pensions, things that really matter to people, the cost of living, income versus expenditure, and you go in because you've got strong wills on those parts. And public policy for politicians these days is not only the digitalisation that's making an impact, there are other factors that are equally important. Internationalisation, so anybody, any place knows more about what's going on in other places than they did back in time. The education is more equalised, so there are more people who know what's going on and have the ability to analyse what's going on and interpret what's going on and work out what's right and wrong and how things could be done differently. These are all factors, and so therefore it's the nature of being a politician has had to change. And that leads us closer towards direct democracy. But I am very much a conservative when it comes to direct democracy because it takes a certain type of person who's prepared for all the sacrifice.
You're not going to get everybody. Yeah.
So therefore, I do believe direct democracy is an idea that's 2,000 or 3,000 years old in one sense, but most systems end up with a system of responsible government, accountable government inside a representative democracy. There are ways about how you can put together that representation. There are decisions to be made about how the government, the executive, is responsible to the people.
Well, one of the analogies that I've used recently to try, I was thinking of a way. I don't have a problem with representative government at all. I think the way I imagine it is you've got a playground full of children. These are all the MHKs. If you want brilliance, you want really good ideas, and you want things to move forward, you have to give those playground full of children the freedom to come up with those good ideas. But once they've come up with a really good idea, the public should be there to support that. And so, yes, that's the one. That's the one I want. That's the policy decision I want. That's the direction I want. That's a really good idea. Let's go with that. And the flip side is if you see little Jimmy climbing up onto the roof and taking everybody with him, and you think that's a bad idea. You can also say, hang on, so I don't have a problem with the idea of representative government.
But also the 24 MHKs sitting in the House of Keys and then playing the full part in Tynwald, that's not where policy comes from. They have an influence.
But it is at the moment, though, isn't it?
I don't think so, even. No. The civil service is one input.
Well, yeah.
And that's the one that's, I think, predominates at the minute
That's
in
a
the way
problem,
we
do you think?
structure. But we ought to find ways to bring in the general public, and the general public do find ways to make themselves heard. So, for instance, 6,500 people signing a toilet tax petition got rid of one piece of law and has influenced the development of the second piece of law. 3,500 people signing a petition about the promenade has changed £21 million of capital expenditure. So the people are there involved. And what we also have to reflect on is that there's lots of other policy sources. So I mentioned international, because you have international dimensions that we have to take account of. There's also interest groups, and what we lack in the Isle of Man, I think, is that, and this is pointed out very, very plainly in an article I read recently about nature conservation groups. You know, with only 85,000 people, we haven't necessarily got enough income base for those charities to have to act in the same way as they would in England or in America or in Germany, and that's an issue we've got to address. So sometimes we have to fall back on foreign interest groups, to, like this current modernisation of abortion laws and so on. These issues don't come forward so quickly in the Isle of Man, purely and simply because we've got loads of very enthusiastic, talented people, but we don't have the infrastructure of
well, yeah, that's good. Well, I mean, the process. I think that. Well, I assume you would agree that the process could be made more efficient if it was more of an ongoing conversation than like the situation with the toilet tax, where it was. The perception is the government has done something we don't like, and we've got to react to that. If it was more of an open conversation continually, you wouldn't have to have these higgledy-piggledy, stop and start situations. And the same with the prom, to a certain extent.
The role of a politician is to be trusted to represent people, but also to make judgments from time to time, voting and how policy comes forward. And it's an old saying that you earn trust, and I think one of the most important ways to earn trust is actually to listen as well as to
going
talk.
Back to the local authority. Just one last thing that popped into my head. One of the issues that Ali raised when I was speaking to her is that one of the things that she was interested in her local community was to do with highways. She was concerned about. She wanted a crossing point because there's no crossing point in Ballabeg, and traffic past the school, and that brings us back to this sort of the relationship on a national or local level.
And it's not only national, local; it's also technical versus not technical. So, for instance, most people I've met to do with streetlights, try to deliver what the public want, but they tell me that the public's not absolutely expert on exactly what a LED effect is going to be on their bedroom window, and so there's a degree of trusting professionals. Traffic safety might be a similar issue.
Well, that's what I was thinking, is that somebody in her situation, that then becomes that she wants something very specific for her village, and so then you're then stepping outside of effectively. I mean, there might be an overall government policy because you have a main government policy that road safety or whatever. But when somebody like that has something, and maybe the whole village wants a crossing and wants something done about road safety outside the primary school. How does that interact with your model of local authorities sort of deciding on policy first and then?
It goes back to the essence of the way that we do politics, which is that there's always what suits me, what suits people who live around me, what suits people who live in the next street, what suits people who live there. So I don't imagine that road is also a thoroughfare as well as a road that you have to cross to go to school. Yeah. So therefore that has to be balanced by the professionals and the politicians. And likewise, we have roads where I have the privilege to represent in Central Douglas, West Douglas. We have roads that we would quite like to calm the traffic flow. Ballinard Road, recently resurfaced, really straight road.
Zipping along there now.
Some of the speeds in the middle of the night are 80 or 90 miles an hour, which the local residents know, and so they would like crossings and things done with the crossings to use them for traffic calming. But at the end of the day, it is the way you get out of Douglas, and you've started having a different mindset. So all I can say is that the professionals in that area, do have tricks and do have ways of doing for people. And recently, especially, I've been very impressed with the way that they will meet groups of residents on site and discuss issues, because they've always said that they've learned things from meeting local people and understanding a bit more how people behave, because machines can't tell you everything at every time. So the machines only get put in a certain place for a period.
Yeah, they're just collecting data.
And they can use local information to put them in different places at different times, put in different types of machines to validate what local people are telling them. So it's got to be, I've got to be honest, it's during my time in Home Affairs and Infrastructure and DEFRA, you also have to understand it from an officer's point of view. It's at first sight, there are two things that might occur to an officer when you get involved in this listening to the public process. The first one is, isn't that something that's casting doubt on my professionalism? Because I've professionally qualified, I've got years of experience, years of education, and so on. And secondly, it takes a lot more time to actually go out, and because you understand that there are all sorts of perspectives that need to be balanced. If your professional thing is telling you that ultimately they'll come to this conclusion, are you not best off proposing that and then letting them react? And so on and so on. So therefore, all these issues have to be balanced, because politicians are not managers, but politicians live in a context of a large civil and public service. In my home.
Overall, though, I think I get the impression that you quite support the idea that, given that the Ballynard Road is a good example, statistically, professionally, one assumes that there is an issue there if you've got people doing 90 miles an hour in a 30 mile an hour zone. So, there is a process which should be triggered by that data set. At the personal level, I don't think you have a problem with say, for example, the people on Ballynard Road saying there's people doing 90 miles an hour on our road here. Can we lend power to make that happen? And
it's only one or two, and it's only at the
I know, but the point is that I think you are. I hope that you see that there's two sort of there's two ways that can be dealt with, and one can help the other.
That's it. So therefore, it then becomes getting the police, road safety unit, road policing unit, infrastructure to work on it, to build the case, and then to prioritise it according to the risk.
One of the issues that I chatted with Phil about earlier this week was that that in my perception, that it would help the public if that whole process was more visible.
And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to put together objective systems so that we have a 5-year plan. And I saw an example in Manchester to do with roads, and I sort of got the information that we have made available through Hansard, through Tynwald questions or Keys questions. But just simply saying how much it costs to fill a pothole in this way, how much it costs to take it off and put it down, that's helpful. And then secondly, working through the factors we use in making decisions.
But it would take a very simple website, wouldn't it, to say, potholes is a great example. There's an app now, I think, isn't there, where you can report. So it would be, I think it would help people understand. So you've reported a pothole. It'd be great if you go to a website and see that pothole had been logged, and see where the process was for for that pothole being sorted out. See what somebody's looked at it, that it's being actioned. There's a because at the moment the perception is that it goes into a into a cloud somewhere and never you end up complaining about it again. Whereas if it's on a website somewhere and you say, well, yes, it's logged and it's in a queue. If it's in a queue and everybody sees the queue, everybody knows.
And that's what we're aiming for. But you've also got to understand that when the main issue that people see is the pothole, they don't see the fact that they don't know when it's going to be done.
Process.
So therefore, it's a question of catching up. At the minute we just have statements like we have 1 billion pounds worth of roads around the island. I roughly know, I was told recently what the value of them was in Douglas. We know roughly that figures, but we don't actually know, because it's very hard to enumerate. We don't actually know what work completely needs to be done. We're getting pretty close to knowing, and then there's a process of scheduling it, and then there's a process of devising the system to keep the public in touch. So it's the same group of people. There are less of them there are fewer of them than there used to be. So we've just got to prioritise work, and often there's a demand for data for data's sake. And when you've started living the issues and the solutions to the issues, you understand that it could be frustrating for an officer to say, well, do you want me to fix the problem, or do you want me to tell you how I'm going to fix the problem? And I think the man in the street would say, just get the problem fixed without telling us about about it.
Yeah.
And later on, we can use the public and we can bring the public in to help us and keep them better.
Yeah,
better
I mean, I suppose in my mind, I see it, because when somebody uses the pothole app, for example, I know that data is going into a process, which should be triggering other actions, and I know that from running my own company that it would be relatively straightforward for that data to be published, so that I know that the pothole that I've logged has, it's just a case of processing data, and I know the step that's supposed to happen next. I know when that's supposed to, and I can see that it's in a queue, and I think that would just eliminate so much of the mistrust is not the right word, but you know what I mean.
Well, let's try.
Let's
try. And then groups of people who care about parking get in touch with us. If enough of them get in touch with us, and we've got a scientific way now of assessing what's enough people, because people don't always agree about how parking should be changed in their regions. So as long as we can become convinced that the majority of people in one area want something to happen,
that you're sort of
trying
for that. What I'll do is I'll reset the camera and we'll go for a different subject then.
Okay.
That's all right.